Okay, look right. Oh, I was going to look up there.
So the table, focus on the center. Channing, focus on there.
Just look there. Okay,
Yeah.
it's good. I was going to look at the. Just to not look at the camera.
Okay, we're gonna start, Channing.
Okay. Hello and welcome from the Joseph B. Martin Conference Center here at Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. We are so pleased to welcome people from all over the world who are joining us and having this very important conversation about progressive multiple sclerosis. My name is Channing Barker, and I'm a journalist living in the United States, working for an American television station in Northwest Arkansas. I live with multiple sclerosis and am a passionate activist and fundraiser. It's a pleasure to be here and be joined by this wonderful panel we have today to talk about the hope and the progress that's being made for people with progressive multiple sclerosis. This is just the first of several webinars that is being hosted by the International Progressive MS Alliance. The Alliance is bringing the world together to solve progressive MS, so we really thank you for being with us today. Ending progressive multiple sclerosis is an urgent need, and it's an unmet need at that. Worldwide, 2.3 million people live with MS, which is a complex, degenerative neurological disease which attacks the brain and the spinal cord. There are two forms of MS: relapsing MS, which I was diagnosed with when I was 16 years old, and a more progressive form. People with relapsing MS, like me, face the daily uncertainty of if and when our disease will convert to a progressive form. People living with progressive disease, which is often a more debilitating form of multiple sclerosis, now have hope for the future. This new optimism is the result of recent scientific progress, including the emergence of the first potential therapies for progressive disease and the continued work of the International Progressive MS Alliance. This is fueling advance in awareness, understanding, and research that we are so thankful for. But even with the excitement of the first therapies for progressive MS, we know that these will only be effective for some time. So we must do more so that everyone has an effective treatment and that it be available. During today's discussion, we're going to talk about the uncertainty and unpredictability of progressive MS and how the world is coming together to address this disease. We're going to learn more about how the Alliance is changing the landscape of progressive MS and funding some of the largest, most collaborative and innovative research, moving us faster toward answers to this urgent unmet need. So some very exciting things going on in the world of progressive MS. I am very pleased today to be joined by our wonderful and innovative panel. So let's get started. First, we have Graham McReynolds. Graham is the Chief Marketing and Development Officer for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society in the United States, and he is also a member of the Executive Committee for the MS Alliance. We are very proud and thankful for Graham today. Dr. Tim Kutze is the Chief Advocacy Services and Research Officer for the National MS Society in the United States, and he is also a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. Thank you, Dr. Tim Kutze, for being with us as well today. Jonathan Strum is a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee, and he lives in California, and he's going to share a little bit about his story in just a minute as he cares for his wife who has secondary progressive MS. John has delivered workshops and offered coaching to other MS caregivers. John, thank you so much for being here and traveling here today as well. And Dr. Francisco Quintana is the lead researcher for one of the 3 Collaborative Network Awards exclusively funded by the Alliance, which we're going to hear more about shortly. And he is an associate professor at the Ann Romney Center for Neurologic Diseases at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School here in Boston. Dr. Quintana's major research interests focus on the regulation of the immune system in multiple sclerosis. Thank you so much, Dr. Quintana, for being here today as well. So let's kick things off and speak with John today, who is going to share a little bit about his personal story. So John, to find solutions, we need to understand what it means to live with progressive MS. And this is something that you have been highly involved with, taking care of your wife. Like many people who have joined us today on this webinar, progressive MS has significantly impacted your life. Can you tell us about your experience with progressive MS, please?
Well, at the time of her diagnosis, my wife Jean was a successful writer, and progressive MS took that away from her. She was an avid cyclist. She used to ride her bike 40 miles every morning, and next to biking, she loved hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains, and progressive MS took both of those things away from her. In less than 10 years, progressive MS made Jean a bedbound quadriplegic. MS-related swallowing problems forced her to receive all of her nutrition through a feeding tube. Progressive MS has impacted her vision, robbed her of her short-term memory, created significant cognitive decline, and left her unable to speak. And progressive MS knocked me off what some might consider a successful career path. I stopped working for about 11 years to take care of Jean at home, which, by the way, progressive MS had turned into what looked more like a clinic than a home. We had a hospital bed, a special low air loss mattress, IV equipment, a full assortment of medications that we used to manage some of her symptoms, and all sorts of medical equipment. Eventually, I even brought in a live-in nurse. And in spite of having really good health insurance, so many things like that live-in nurse, several travel expenses for multiple week-long trips to the Cleveland Clinic, or even a home health aide, they just weren't covered. So progressive MS eventually took all of our money too. Jean finally reached a point where she couldn't be cared for at home, and so progressive MS took Jean out of our home. Today she's in a subacute nursing facility where I visit her every day. So in our case, progressive MS took just about everything. I think if you had asked me how progressive MS hadn't impacted our lives, I could have given you a much shorter answer.
John, thank you for sharing your story. And your story is, I have a feeling, much like many of our viewers who are watching, and they can empathize and sympathize with what you have been dealing with. And so thank you for sharing that with us today. Graham McReynolds, I want to turn to you now because John just shared his story about the very real challenges that he, his family, and so many others are dealing with. Is it something that all of us are affected by? Yes, it is, but how can we move forward? So what is, I guess, the next step, since so many of us are affected by MS and we are all concerned about?
Channing, all of us listen to John and Jean's story, and it's so powerful and it's so moving. But being moved is not enough. We have to be moved to action. We have seen such tremendous progress over the last 20 years in relapsing MS. There's a multitude of treatments now available for people who are affected by relapsing MS. And that's something we can pause and we can all celebrate that. But every time a new treatment for relapsing MS is approved, people who are affected by progressive MS feel ignored or left behind. Where's my treatment? And that's intolerable. It's an intolerable situation and something we must change. And we also know that the solutions won't be easy, that it is unlikely that one treatment is going to work for everyone with progressive MS, that we will need options. People will need choices to get the right treatment for them so they can live their best lives. So we must accelerate progress and we must find answers.
For me, I know as someone living with relapsing MS, there were only 4 treatments available when I was diagnosed 11 years ago. Now there's a multitude. But like you said, Graham, when it comes to progressive MS, it's almost like the door is shut for them. And so that's what we're working to today to find more treatments. So how is the world collaborating when it comes to solving this problem?
Well, not so very many years ago, right here in Boston, Massachusetts, a group of leading MS researchers and scientists came together with some of the leading MS organizations in the world, and they looked at where we were. It wasn't that there wasn't research going on in progressive MS, but we weren't going fast enough. We weren't finding the answers. We were finding as many barriers as we were paths forward, and we knew that something had to be different. We had to change the way we were playing the game around that. And so just like any time you solve a really big, complex problem, we took that strategy. We brought together the smartest, brightest, most engaged people we knew. We brought together people who were living with and affected by progressive MS. We brought together leading MS researchers. We brought in the pharmaceutical industry leaders in MS and MS organizations from around the world. And thus, the International Progressive MS Alliance was formed. And what guides us is that we have a shared urgency to fund the best research that finds answers.
The word urgent also being heard once again, and then also collaborative and network being heard a lot today. So we've talked about how we got to create this alliance. Tell me where we are, Graham, today.
Well, today it's really remarkable. We have grown to become an unprecedented global collaboration. We are centered and led by people living with and affected by progressive MS. We have 16 MS organizations actively involved from around the world and others supporting this work. We have 8 trusts and foundations engaged in the work. We have 5 of the leading MS pharmaceutical companies involved, and we have a multitude of scientists from 17 countries helping move this work forward. So we've really rallied the MS community around this. And we are building upon the important work and research and findings that have already been done in progressive MS, but saying now, how do we take all of that and now accelerate progress? How do we build upon that that will result in people getting the treatments they need to live their best lives?
And we've seen that slide that talked about the 16 MS organizations that are in the Alliance. Astounding numbers there, because it takes a village to solve this problem. So can you tell me more about how you got those researchers together?
I think this is something we're just really proud of, this accomplishment of just really getting the leading MS researchers worldwide engaged. And you see their demonstrated persistence, their knowledge, and their passion. Then they have formed into really nothing short of a brilliant scientific steering committee. And they're really the basis of this strategy of really where are the places that we have to remove barriers and where must we find new answers that are going to result in new and effective treatments. So every day we make a little progress and more people join the Progressive MS Alliance, and each new member makes us stronger and makes us accelerate our pace.
Once again, together, stronger, joining together and collaborating. I want to talk to Dr. Tim Kutze now because Dr. Kutze, chiropractic treatments for progressive MS are going to have a profound effect on improving the quality of life for people with progressive MS. So why are finding treatments for progressive MS particularly difficult comparatively to the other forms of the disease?
You know, Channing, that's a really critical and important question. And, you know, we can start off by saying that one of the challenges we face is that the patterns of the disease and how progressive MS affects individuals varies from person to person. Gene has one story, and many of our viewers will have their own story about how progressive MS is affecting them individually. And so this creates a big challenge that we have to overcome to try to identify the new treatments, to really try to understand how is the disease different in each person. This makes the conduct of clinical trials particularly challenging because individual experiences can affect the outcome. But this is where the Alliance comes in because we've recognized that we have to take on these big barriers and really address them in a robust and meaningful way. And, you know, as John said, progressive MS has taken a lot from John and his family, and really the scientists are determined to change that story and take something back from progressive MS.
Dr. Kutze, I wanted to know now if you can elaborate more on those specific barriers, because we talked about how John and his family have had to deal with the barriers when it comes to progressive MS. So can you talk about those challenges for progress and solutions for people with the disease?
Sure, and I think the place to begin is to acknowledge that we have had a lot of progress in relapsing and remitting MS, and that, you know, we have a number of disease-modifying treatments which are changing the trajectory for people who are diagnosed with that form of MS. And that's come because of the investments in lots of science that has really helped us understand how the immune system works in relapsing MS. You know, unfortunately, that's not where we are in progressive MS. And so as we think about this in terms of progressive MS, you know, there are four big questions that we are focused on. And so the first one is, you know, can we identify what's causing the damage to nerve cells and myelin in progressive MS? Because if we can solve that, then we can start to develop those treatments to change that. The second big question is, you know, how do we measure progression and how do we determine whether or not function is being restored by these treatments? And the way to imagine this is that if you go to the doctor and you think you have high blood pressure, he will measure your blood pressure with a very easy tool and device. And we don't have that in progressive MS today. And so we need those quick tools that let us measure whether or not treatments are working. The third big question is, how do we do clinical trials faster and so that we can know whether or not a treatment is working? Right now, progressive MS trials can take 2 to 3 years, and that's just too long for people living with this disease, so we need to change that. And then the last question, which is just as important as the other three, is can we find the solutions that address those symptoms today that people living with progressive MS experience of pain, fatigue, cognition, which can be have such a great impact on the quality of life. And so those together are what are driving us in terms of our scientific strategy.
And Dr. Kutze, you hit on a lot of things that I think people, not just with progressive MS and their caregivers, are dealing with, but also if we can find solution and address those things, it will also, I imagine, help people who are living with relapsing remitting MS, correct?
That's right, and that's our focus is around speeding up research to really tackle all of this. And so when to step back, when we started our work together, we first asked ourselves within the MS societies that make up the Alliance is, we're funding lots of research now. Are there projects that we are funding that touch on progressive MS? And so when we went through our portfolios, we learned that there's about 400 projects that we are supporting collectively as an MS community that touch on different aspects of progressive MS. And so that's a sizable investment. But what we also learned was that many of these projects were taking place in a disconnected and isolated manner. And so we set about to break down those silos And so our first step in breaking down those silos was to say, let's create momentum. Let's bring the community together to collectively fund research. And that's when we launched the Alliance's Challenge Award program, where we basically put out a call for scientists to come to us with their innovative and groundbreaking ideas. And so we received 195 proposals that from there we selected 22 what we call challenge awards. And those were focused on creating momentum in progressive MS by saying to the world, let's work together. That then set the stage for our next program, which we call the Collaborative Network Award. And that program has a very simple idea, is can we get teams of scientists working together to create collaborative research networks, because we believe that the power of collaboration will speed up the research process substantially. And so there we invested in 3 teams. We'll hear from one of the team leaders soon. And that amounted to about 12.6 million euro of a financial investment. But the important thing is that we had over 40 researchers from 9 different countries working together. And so this is the kind of innovative approach and leadership that we are able to do through the Alliance, which lets us demonstrate that we are changing the trajectory for people with progressive MS.
And it seems like you're changing the face as well as to what research for progressive MS really looks like as well. So can you talk about those 3 collaborative network awards that are aiming to address those 4 big questions that you spoke of?
Certainly, and we are very excited about the collaboration that we are able to facilitate through the Alliance with these 3 teams. Each of them touches on on the questions that we are working on specifically. So the first project I'll speak to is led by Professor Gianvito Martino, who is leading the Brave in MS team. And Professor Martino's team is focused specifically on finding drugs that can repair the damage that is associated with progressive MS. And so they're setting about to do this work by aiming on 4 different aspects of this. The first is to develop the tools to find the drugs that can repair damage in progressive MS. The second is to essentially invent the technology for testing whether or not these potential treatments can actually work and promote remyelination and repair in the nervous system. And then the next phase is to understand how those potential treatments are working in the brain, because it's important that we have a good understanding of what myelin repair looks like in an individual when they're taking that. And then the last and critical step is they want to start testing those treatments in people, because it's not good enough to just study them in the lab. We have to get these treatments into people living with progressive MS. In addition, we'll hear shortly from the project led by Dr. Francisco Quintana here at Harvard. He is leading a research team that's focused on managing the immune system in progressive MS and trying to address how the immune system attacks and it creates damage in progressive MS, and finding drugs that can change that trajectory. And then lastly, Dr. Doug Arnold, who works at the Montreal Neurological Institute, is tackling the question of, can we create the tools that let us measure whether or not a treatment is working in progressive MS. And he is developing this tool by using the MRI. And I think many people using this will be familiar with MRIs, and you'll have had MRIs, and many of these images get stored in databases. And so what Dr. Arnold has done is proposing that we gather together all of the MRIs for individuals that have participated in clinical trials and ask the question, can we develop computer tools that let us predict, by looking at all these thousands of MRIs, as to whether or not there's a signature that says this image or this set of images in a brain of an individual predicts how the drug how they may do when taking a particular treatment, or how the disease will progress. This is, for some have described it, a big data project. But the important thing about this big data project is he's also building on investments that have been made by people with MS participating in clinical trials and bringing together information that already exists. So we are actually taking advantage of lots of work that's being done. And this will help us speed up the process of conducting clinical trials, which will be a really critical and important landmark for people with MS.
It's putting it on the fast track, so I love seeing that.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kudsi, for explaining so thoroughly each of those projects. And one of the awards is with Dr. Francisco Cantina. And Dr. Cantina, if you can talk to me as one of the lead investigators for the Collaborative Network Awards. Thank you, first of all, so much for doing the work you do. How did you become involved in the MS field?
So I grew up very close to my grandfather, and he was this type of towering figure, right? Very important, very central to my life. And then through the years, I lost him to neurodegenerative disease. So that actually marked me, and that led me, that directed my research and my interest in trying to understand what caused the damage and actually potentially how we could intervene.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Quintana, about how you got involved in the MS field. Like so many people, everyone has a connection of some kind to this disease. So your team is working, like Dr. Kudsi kind of explained, your team is working to identify drug candidates and to identify the molecules that may be effective therapies for progressive MS. But as someone like myself who does not have a scientific background, Dr. Quintana, can you explain what that actually means in layman's terms, please?
So what we are trying to do is we're trying to understand what causes the damage in progressive MS. In particular, what parts of the immune system, of the immune response, are responsible for that. And the reason for that is very simple. We want to understand what causes the damage as a way of trying to understand how we can intervene. How can we identify drugs that probably are already out there and can be repurposed to treat MS? How can we identify new drugs, right? Or how can we potentially say or identify specific components of the body that we could target? Obviously, that's not an easy question. And indeed, it's a question to which we got after years of research and years of support by the MS community. And in particular, in the last couple of years, first through these Challenge Awards, we were able to try to understand specifically how to focus or how to address the problem. And then actually what it was very obvious to us that this is an immense problem. This is a very complex problem that requires a collaboration and work not only of our own expertise, but actually expertise from other fields. And with the support of the society, actually, of the Alliance, we were able to recruit what I would say are actually leaders in the field and leaders in complementary areas of expertise. So we established this international collaboration with people from Israel, which are experts in trying to understand how the genome controls damage within the CNS. We're also able to establish collaborations with experts, not only from here, Harvard, but also from Canada, which are also experts in specific components of the immune system that are important in causing damage in progressive MS. So we're putting together and we're actually channeling all our efforts and our expertise as a way of trying to understand, again, what causes multiple sclerosis, what causes progression in multiple sclerosis, and what are potential drugs that we can repurpose as a therapy for progressive MS.
It seems like you're evaluating and looking and identifying all sorts of ways and drugs for progressive MS. And I know people like myself and John and his family appreciate the work that you are doing. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. When you were speaking about your research and what you're doing, what question is this going to help answer? And what do you anticipate that people with MS, Dr. Quintana, can expect from this 4-year study?
So you could think that we are going to address two very straightforward questions. What causes damage in progressive MS? And related to that, we are hoping to identify drugs that can be actually tested as potential therapeutics for progressive MS.
Okay. And what do you want people to know who maybe have MS that are watching today? What do you want them to know, and particularly those with progressive MS, like John's wife? What do you want them to know about the work and the scientific and academic community as a whole, what you are doing, what do you think the most important aspect of your work is, and what we, as somebody who has MS and is caregiving for someone with the disease, what do you think that we need to know and take away?
So I would like them to know that there's a tremendous effort aimed at identifying therapies for progressive MS, and this is an international effort that basically involves all the most important MS organizations. So just get involved, and we are working towards that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for all your work. Dr. Coetzee, I want to know, as someone who's been on the Alliance since the beginning, and for people who might not know about the Alliance until today's webinar, how has it shaped your perspective of progressive MS?
You know, that's a great question, and I think that, as you say, having been within this journey of the Alliance since the beginning, from the meeting that Graham alluded to here in Boston just a few years ago, I'd say sort of three things come to mind. One is, you know, when we first convened in Boston, just the challenges, the scientific challenges of progressive MS seemed just enormous. The barriers to finding the treatments, understanding the disease, you know, how we would do clinical trials, all just seemed just huge and potentially sometimes insurmountable. And it was the collective action of the MS societies and the scientists and people living with MS who basically said to us, yes, there may seem insurmountable, but we simply cannot let that stand. And so it was step by step, getting together, getting the scientists saying, how do we work together? What are the challenges that we have in front of us that we can take one piece at a time? And then can we, as a community, come together to fund science together and engage people with MS from around the globe together? So for me, that has really shaped my thinking about the possibility of what we can do. And that, you know, we are on the cusp soon, hopefully within the next few months, of the first treatment for progressive MS, which we didn't even couldn't see coming just a few years ago. So, you know, I am optimistic that, you know, we are changing the trajectory for people who live with progressive MS, and that it is a challenging set of science and research that needs to be done. But what I also see is a community that has said, we are ready to rise to this task. So as someone who's been involved, I'm inspired and also optimistic by what we will be able to accomplish.
And it's not just a community here in the United States or overseas. It is a worldwide collaboration of so many researchers and so many organizations coming together. So there is so much hope and progress being made too. It's not just hope, it is progress, true research being done. John, I want to ask you, as someone, you know, we just heard from Dr. Coetzee about how he's seen the Alliance really shape his perspective, but as someone who has just joined the Alliance and you have been helping to lead important work, how has this shaped your perspective?
Well, I guess I'd want to let everyone know what I've learned since I have started working with the Alliance, and that is that today there's real hope on the horizon. I've met brilliant researchers like Dr. Quintana who are focused on helping solve the riddle of progressive MS. I've met some of the best and brightest minds, some of the greatest neuroscientists in the world on the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. And I've seen and I've heard their commitment to moving the work of the Progressive MS Alliance forward. You know, sometimes understanding some of the science can be a little challenging. But when members of the Scientific Steering Committee talk about not wanting to lose momentum and wanting to really move the ball down the field, their sense of urgency and focus on the mission of the Alliance is very easy for me to understand. So I guess I'd want others to know that now some of the best and brightest minds in the world are working hard to solve progressive MS. I'd want them to know that there's finally good news and important research being done in laboratories around the world. I guess I'd want others in the progressive MS community to be as hopeful for the future as I am.
And we can certainly hear that hope in your story and also in your voice. So thank you so much, John, for being here, for sharing your story, and for doing all that you've done, especially as being part of this alliance. You've really transformed what you can do when it comes to caregiving and for living with someone who has the disease, progressive MS. Thank you so much. As we close out this webinar, Graham, I wanted to ask you a question, kind of a call to action, because people who are watching today, they don't want to just watch the webinar and go back to their daily life. They want to get involved. I'm hopeful that you want to get involved and you can make a difference, as our panel has made a difference. So what can people do as the next step?
Well, first, I would like to thank everybody for joining, because that is the first step, is being informed, right? And stay informed. Continue to gather information and share what you know with others and bring them into the Progressive MS Alliance. Pledge your support. Get involved with your local MS organization. We are trying to change the world for people with progressive MS, and it's going to take all of us.
Graham, thank you so much. We want to thank our panel today, Graham McReynolds, Dr. Tim Cutsey, Dr. Quintana, and of course, John. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it, and we are so thankful for the work that's being done by each and every one of you, whether you are here on our panel today or whether you are watching from your computer or wherever it might be in the world. Thank you for joining in. And I want to leave you today with some good news, if you didn't already have enough good news with our panel, because they talked about the hope, but they talked also about progress that's being made. It's about real progress and real research that is taking us one step closer to a cure. And like Graham said, we want you to stay involved and donate to progressivemsalliance.org, because that is a way that you too can change the world for everyone living with progressive MS. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.